I'm Travis English. I'm WECC's Training and Outreach Specialist. Thanks for joining us for the Resource Adequacy Discussion Series. Today we'll be talking about spanning the technology gap. It's October 5th, 2022. We'll take a quick look at WECC's antitrust policy. All WECC meetings are conducted in accordance with the WECC antitrust policy and the NERC antitrust compliance guidelines. All participants must comply with the policy and guidelines. This meeting is public. Confidential or proprietary information should not be discussed in the open session. This webinar is also being recorded and it will be posted publicly. By participating, you give your consent for your name, voice, image, and likeness to be included in that recording. WECC strives to ensure the information presented today is accurate and reflects the views of WECC. However, all interpretations and positions are subject to change. If you have any questions, please contact our legal counsel. All right, we'll take a quick look at the program here. We're going to have a welcome by Brandon Sudduth, our Vice President of RAPA here. Then we'll have some WECC and ERR remarks from, excuse me, Melanie, Frye, and Jim Robb. And then we'll turn it over to our panel where we'll be talking about spanning the technology gap with David Boyd as the moderator. And he'll be introducing several of our panelists here in a little bit. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Paul Kjellander and see if perhaps you're able to hear us. Okay, Brandon, I'm going to pass it off to you here, and we will check in with Mr. Kjellander in a little bit. So with that, Brandon Sudduth is going to give us a quick welcome this morning. He's the Vice President of Reliability Planning and Performance Analysis here at WECC. Brandon, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Travis, and good morning, and thank you all for joining us for this month's installment of the Resource Adequacy Discussion Series. So earlier this year, WECC released the 2040 Clean Energy Sensitivity Study. The purpose of that study was to look at challenges in attaining varying degrees of clean energy futures in the year 2040. And the study showed that to get to the future with very few fossil-fueled resources, there would need to be a new type of resource with performance characteristics similar to a gas turbine generator to provide essential reliability services and specifically flexibility needed to preserve reliability. In the study, we called these resources emerging, clean, and flexible energy resource technologies. But the point is that to get to a highly decarbonized future, there is a large gap to be filled by technologies that may or may not be currently known. So on today's webinar, we'll discuss the role of current, emerging, and unknown technologies in filling that gap. We have a great panel lined up, whom you will meet in just a little bit, but first I would like to introduce Jim Robb and Melanie Frye, who will give some opening remarks. So Jim Robb is the current president and CEO of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC. And prior to joining NERC, Jim was the president and CEO of WECC. During Jim's tenure at NERC, resource adequacy has taken center stage among several reliability risks that the industry is currently facing. Following Jim's remarks, we'll hear from Melanie Frye, who many of you know as WECC's current president and CEO, and Melanie will share some of her perspectives from the West. And so with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Jim.
Okay, well, thanks, Brandon, and I really appreciate the invitation to be here and to share a few thoughts with you all. And I see some familiar faces on the panel here, as well as among the attendees. So greetings. First, I think you guys are onto something here, right? Resource adequacy is going to become the defining issue of this era of the electric system. And sometimes I think in an alternate universe or in a previous life, I was a journalist or a historian, but I like to think about the eras of the electric industry to keep things in context. You know, and I go back over the last 50 years, right? The 1970s was really all about building out central station generation, capturing, huge economies of scale with the promise of electricity that was going to be too cheap to meter. Now, of course, that didn't exactly pan out that way, but clearly that was kind of how the 70s played out. And then in the 1980s was really all about gas reform. both the freeing up of wellhead prices and the restructuring of the pipeline industry led to an explosion of natural gas availability, creating the gas bubble, extraordinarily low gas prices for a prolonged period of time, and a pretty important technology development with General Electric's release of the combined cycle gas turbine, which substantially reduced the marginal cost of producing power. You know, go to the 1990s, everything was about kind of restructuring markets, introduction of wholesale competition, and in some places, retail competition. 2000s really defined by price volatility, driven by both the mid-decade hurricanes that significantly interrupted gas supply, and then the Great Recession at the tail end of that decade. You know, the 2010s, really all about renewables, capturing extraordinary improvements in productivity related to the production of panels and wind farms, that really lowered the cost of renewable energy, and the expansion of distributed energy resources, both behind the meter and on the distribution system. Kind of fast forward that to where we are today, I really think the decade that we're in, and it may span more than a decade, is really going to be all about resource adequacy, but not resource adequacy the way our grandfather thought about it. You know, we're having to do this in a period where we're seeing more and more extreme weather events. And by extreme, I certainly don't mean infrequent, because as you all know in the West, right, these have become relatively commonplace, whether it's drought, broad heat domes impacting much larger areas of the country than what we've seen before, longer duration events like that 8 or 9 day heat wave you all had to work through over Labor Day. Because it's a very, very different weather environment for the industry to cope with. And we're also doing this at a time where we're trying to retire a lot of older emitting generation, replacing it with low or no emitting generation. But we're doing that in a period where we anticipate significant demand growth as well. Whether that's through electrification of transportation, electrification of space heating, and other industrial processes. So really a lot of things coming together right now to really test the ability of the electric system to meet customer needs, both for security of supply, doing that cost effectively, and doing it in a way that promotes the sustainability of the sector. And I think that trilemma of environmental impact, access, affordability, and reliability and security is something we always have to keep in mind as we move forward. You know, I mentioned that this wasn't our grandfather's resource adequacy problem, because the way our grandfathers thought about it, and some of us in this room, and I throw myself in that category, right? We always focused on capacity on peak, because we always thought if we had enough capacity to meet the peak hour, plus a margin that would take into account random failures around the system, we had a pretty good shot at delivering energy every other hour of the year. Well, as we move to a different fuel base, which is, will be large part variable resource dependent upon weather patterns, whether that's, is the sun shining today, or is there a marine layer? Is it windy? Is it too windy? Or is it right in the strike zone of generating wind power? Did we have a good hydro year or a bad hydro year? You know, what is the gas system stressed, or is it able to meet all of its commitments with no issues, right? When we have that kind of variability and uncertainty in the fuel supply, we really have to move away from capacity plus a reserve margin on peak to really focusing in on the ability of the sector to deliver energy. Because ultimately energy is what customers consume. They don't consume capacity. And we have to be able to assure ourselves that we can deliver energy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, under a wide variety of environmental conditions. And if anything I've come to appreciate over the last several years is that the tails of if we think about the environment that we operate in as a distribution of outcomes, those tails are becoming really, really important. And I think as we learned in Texas during Winter Storm Uri, when the system can't perform, it's typically when conditions are really lousy. And that's when customers can take things into their own hands. And in the case of Texas, as is well documented, 250 plus or minus people died as a result of not having a reliable source of electricity and heat in their homes. So it's a very important issue. It's a very timely issue. It's a very complex issue. And it needs to be thought of in a way differently than the way we've thought about it in the past. And I think WECC and stakeholders in the West are perfectly suited to really lead the thinking on behalf of the industry as to how to cope with a highly variable resource base, extreme weather conditions, rampant demand growth, and still be able to, as I say, keep the lights on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. I want to switch and just talk a few thoughts about technology. I think one of the things that we've all come to realize is that we've all become enamored with what I'll call magical thinking, and I don't mean that disparagingly, but I always think back on the evolution of personal electronics. And some of you may remember in 1987, for those of you who are alive in 1987, Apple released a video called the Knowledge Navigator. And if you Google it or look it up on YouTube, you'll see it. And you'll look at it now and you'll say, well, that's pretty interesting. But when we first saw that in 1987, we all jaws dropped. People thought, what an extraordinary vision of something that will probably never come to pass. Well, over the next 10 to 15 years, a series of technology breakthroughs made that vision almost a reality. Starting with the release of the Apple Newton in 1993, not a particularly successful device, but showed a lot of creative thinking and promise. It was followed by the Palm Pilot in 1997, which we all thought was a terrific device, up until BlackBerry came forward and put a cellular connection on that. We were now untethered from our computers and the hardwired connections that we needed. That was 1999. And then, of course, in 2007, when Steve Jobs, stood up and held up an iPhone, we really saw the extraordinary progress that was made in the area of kind of personal communications, personal digital assistance, that only 20 years earlier we thought was a preposterous idea. If you think about the expansion of Wi-Fi services and the ubiquity of Wi-Fi services in people's homes and the use of personal assistants like Alexa or Hey Siri, again, it's just a very, very different world than what we could have imagined, even 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And I think we'll see the same thing in energy, right? There's clearly need for new technology here, particularly around storage. And whether that be a hydrogen system, batteries, the use of small nuclear reactors, maybe all of the above will come into play. But I think there's some need to be for some sober thinking here. Because the electric system is just too fundamental and too valuable to risk. As my buddy Tom Fanning of the Southern Company is wont to say, electricity is 7% of the economy, but it's the first 7%. Because without the juice, nothing else works. And as we continue to electrify end-use applications, transportation, space heating, industrial processes, as well as all the other stuff that's already electrified, the day you flip the switch and the lights don't come on is increasingly the definition of a bad day. And speaking of Hey Siri, I just woke my phone up, so I apologize for that. I'll wrap up, but I think on energy storage in particular, that really is the holy grail that will really change the way we think about the reliability and resource adequacy equation. And look, we've got really good initial steps on storage. The amount of battery capacity that's been put in place, particularly in California, but elsewhere around the country, is making a real difference. We saw that in the heat wave that you all experienced a few weeks ago. And I think we should honor and respect what lithium-ion batteries have been able to do. I would also submit that they're nowhere near close to what we need to really envision a fully decarbonized system. And I think it's always important to remember that batteries are not a generating source. Batteries are a time machine, right? They move power from one period of time to another, but you still need something to interject BTUs or kilowatt hours into the device. And as we think about our electrification challenge going forward, the need for more BTUs is something that I think we have to have very sober thinking about, and making sure that we're always maintaining an appropriate energy balance across different technologies. So I told Melanie I was going to stick myself to 10 minutes. I obviously did not do that, so I'll apologize for blowing the agenda already. Brandon, with that, I will, again, I appreciate the opportunity to share some thinking, and I'll turn it back to you. So thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Melanie.
Great. Thank you. I just want to verify you can hear me okay? Excellent. You know, Jim, I think you did a remarkable job. If I was keeping track of time, I would say you were pretty close to your 10 minutes. So thanks for sharing those thoughts, and thank you for kind of the trip down memory lane. I still marvel every time I hear someone remind us that the iPhone was only developed in 2007, because it really has become just an appendage that so many of us have at all times, and we take for granted the technology improvements that have been made in a relatively short period of time. So I'd like to focus a little bit more on the resource adequacy conversation and challenges that we have here in the Western Interconnection. You know, the timing of this conversation couldn't be more timely given what we'd all just experienced here in the West with the September heat dome event, another widespread heat event over multiple days, similar to what happened in 2020. This time, the Western Interconnection set a new all-time peak demand, and I think it's really interesting to think about. It was 5,000 megawatts more than just 2 years ago when we set a heat demand record, or a demand record. And I think this is an example of a time where we're really not aiming to set new records. So the new record of 167,530 megawatts is just remarkable, and a sign of things to come, more than likely. So a critical time for the conversation. A couple of points, and Jim touched on this a little bit, but you know, we had a very different experience in September of 2022 with the heat event than the West experienced in August of 2020. So clearly there were some lessons learned around communication and you know, how to navigate the event and the impact of demand response. But I think that, you know, a benefit of the storage and the new technology that had come on the system and the impact that can have. But I think it also illustrated the growing threat of resource shortfalls during extreme events, and you know, we're getting closer to that edge, and that's what, you know, reserve margin planning is all about. One of the metrics that we use to describe and assess the impact of reserve margins is called the Energy Emergency Alert. And for those of you who are familiar with that, there are 3 levels, with an Energy Emergency Alert, or EEA 3, being the most significant level. Typically indicates that load shedding is either in progress or imminent. And if we look at the recent event in September, the Western Interconnection experienced 16 energy emergency alerts during that time period of just over a week. And to put some context around that, comparing that to our history, that's more than the Western Interconnection would experience in an entire year, if we look at years, you know, prior to, say, 2018. And that's significant, and I think that's you know, just one indicator of the growing concern around energy availability to meet the needs at all hours of the day and year. and the fact that the excess capacity or excess energy is not there to be relied upon, as Jim said, in our grandfather's energy system. So as traditional resources are retired and the generation mix changes, it's clear that significant amounts of new resources will be needed, not only to meet the demands of today, but really the increasing demands of the future as we consider electrification of transportation and homes and other things that are part of that conversation. One of the things that we've recently done at WECC is to perform an analysis to just assess, are we on track with the resource additions that have been planned? And our team took a look at data that was submitted to us back in 2016 and 2018 to look at the 5- and 3-year resource plans as of the beginning of 2022. The good news is that as of the beginning of 2022, it appeared we were on track with the resource additions being built as planned. But we know that the world changes, and we've experienced a couple of disrupting events even this year that could further disrupt that, with the increasing supply chain issues affecting equipment availability and increasingly the skilled workforce shortages that are affecting the ability of industry to make available the talent needed to continue with the aggressive growth plans. And finally, I'll mention the increasing interconnection queues and just the processes that need to be in place to expedite that to ensure that the resources will be there in the future. All of that makes it clear that if we're going to be successful as an industry over the next 10 years in building the additional 80,000 megawatts of new resources that are planned to be added, that there is a significant hurdle in front of us, and it will take a significant amount of concerted effort. While today's discussion is focused specifically on resource adequacy, I do want to give a plug that one of the very tightly connected challenges associated with that is the adequacy of the transmission system to be able to transport the energy to the load centers and where it's needed. So I think that's an important part of the conversation that we need to continue to focus on. And just as a final note, I want to give a bit of a plug and a little bit of a heads up on the upcoming 2022 Western Assessment of Resource Adequacy. This is a deeper dive report that WECC has introduced, and this will be our 3rd installment, and is meant to build upon the work that comes out of the NERC long-term reliability assessment, and more specifically focus on these issues for the Western interconnection. We are in the final stages of completing that report and anticipate it will be published next month in November. And so we'll make sure that you get a lot of heads up about outreach opportunities and ability to understand the context of that report. To give you one of the high-level headlines that we're seeing as we've completed our analysis is that in the short term, the resource adequacy picture is looking a bit better. And I'd like to emphasize that is a short-term phenomena and largely a result of delaying resource retirement and other near-term actions that have been taken, which I think is all very good news in the short term. The longer-term picture, though, remains largely unchanged in that we're continuing to see, as these resources, traditional resources, are retired, we do see shrinking reserve margins and an increase in risks to reliability and energy being served at all hours of the day because of the increasing variability. Jim talked about the probability curve and those tails that are increasingly becoming the riskiest times of the year as we look at variability of not only the generating resources, but also the demand patterns and the load, and as we consider future electrification. So I think all of that to say, we're having the right conversations, and I'm thrilled that all of you are here today and continuing the conversation. I know that technology is going to be key to the success and to solving these challenges. And I'm confident with the bright minds that are out there and the focus that's being paid to this issue that we will have our cell phone breakthrough technology as it relates to our industry. So kudos to all of you who are working on that, and I look forward to hearing more from our panelists about the new technologies that are being contemplated and how they will help support future reliability and security. With that, Brandon, I will turn it back to you to continue.
Great. Thank you, Melanie, and thank you too, Jim. I think your comments really set the stage for our discussion today with our panel. I forgot to mention this at the beginning of the webinar, but if you have any questions for our panelists, if you would please enter those in the chat box in WebEx. We will try to address as many as we can, given the time that we have. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our panel moderator, but before I do, I'd like to introduce him. Our panel moderator today will be David Boyd. He is a former Vice President of Government and Regulatory Affairs at MISO and a former chair of the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. So with that, I am going to turn it over to David to lead our panel discussion.
Thanks, Brandon, very much. I can't quite imagine two more concise and insightful introductory sets of comments. And in some sense, I feel like you both crawled inside my head. I have a lot of the same feelings, concerns, and a sense of optimism. And I should also mention that as Murphy's Law lives and breathes, I have a roofing crew here pounding away. So if you hear thunks or noises or a dog howling, don't be alarmed. It's just me. I've crawled as far away from the roof as I can, but we could still be interrupted here. So if you weren't convinced about the ambitious nature of this fleet transformation, I think the introductory comments of Melanie and Jim set the stage really nicely. The trick is, how are we going to balance the sometimes conflicting elements of this transformation or conversion to a clean fleet that's reliable and cost effective in a properly timed and timely manner? That's ignoring the technology challenges of the last 20%. Brandon mentioned it. Utilities that have voiced 100% goals have said, well, we see our way clear to perhaps 80% of that goal with known technologies, but how are we going to get to the last 20%? And what timeline will that happen? What are the risks? What's the cost? And of course, particularly in the West, the utilities and stakeholders are not monolithic. So there are questions about how local, sub-regional, and regional priorities of this transformation will fit together in layers or not fit together in layers. So fortunately, someone other than me is going to answer those questions. We have a set of panelists here who are expert in an array of technologies and will address questions about this transformation. And we certainly are interested in trying to make this a conversation. So as Brandon said, please do submit questions in the chat function, and we'll get to those throughout the time we have left. So let me get on to introducing our panelists. Today, we're very fortunate to have Jeff Bishop, the CEO of Key Capture Energy, Erin Childs, Director with Strategen, Pat Jagtiani, Executive Vice President of the Natural Gas Supply Association, and Paul Kjellander, kind of our Swiss Army knife, formerly the NERC President and a long-serving commissioner on the Idaho PUC, who's now lending his expertise and experience to Idaho National Lab, among others. Panelists, welcome. We don't have a lot of time, and we could do this for hours, so let me shut up and get into it. Let's dig in. As a first topic, interesting question: how can technology balance the variability that comes with solar and wind? And Pat, let me toss that to you to begin with.
Sounds great. Good morning to you, David, and to the panelists, and thank you very much for having me join your panel today. As Jim mentioned, advancements in battery technology are steadily increasing, and I believe there's great promise for them to ultimately be a significant balancing resource. But until we are more readily can rely on longer duration and more widespread application of battery storage, I believe quick ramping natural gas units will continue to be a primary source of balancing as we transition. Like you and WECC, other regions such as ISO New England, New York, ISO, MISO, have sounded the alarm that they have fears that there could be too much of a rapid pace of retirement of dispatchable or balancing resources. And if this happens too quickly, that system reliability could be impacted. I think those are things that we need to focus on: increased transmission, resource adequacy, whether we have sufficient balancing capabilities. But it's also important to take a closer look upstream at whether there's adequate capability to draw on the fuel that supports these quick ramping resources. For instance, many gas units are expected to dramatically change their usage patterns of natural gas, with like overall less demand, but steeper and more frequent draws from pipelines to balance variable energy resources. As New York ISO recently said, response times from resources will need to be faster. And so I think we need to ask the question, can existing pipelines in your footprint handle these sometimes unexpected draws on their system without operational impacts on their own systems or impacting service to other customers? As you may know, pipelines typically require that customers take gas on an equally hourly basis, absent signing an agreement for a special service that permits some type of greater hourly swings. Although you will see that pipelines will allow non-hourly flows when they can operationally accommodate that on a best efforts basis. Many assume that fuel will be there, but pipelines are finite size, and I think it's going to be important that we look at the current utilization of the pipeline systems, and it will be smart to minimize this uncertainty so we can mitigate any potential unexpected surprises.
Thanks, Pat. Jeff, this is something I think you're in a good position to address, particularly the long duration side of this question. Fill us in.
Yeah, definitely. So my name is Jeff Bishop, and I'm a founder and CEO of a 75-person company that just does battery storage. And so as we develop, construct, own, and operate, we are technology agnostic, and we respond to price signals. And so today, in California, in just 1 year, from 2020 to 2021, battery storage projects went from 250 megawatts all the way up to 2,500 megawatts. And so right now, lithium ion based battery storage projects, typically 2 to 4 hours, are really helping to, address peaks. But in the case of, 9-10 day heat waves, obviously we need more. And so recently, back in January, there was a RFP for long duration storage, and that surprisingly to me was won by a 8-hour lithium ion battery. There's all sorts of really interesting, very, very long duration, multi-day technology that's coming out there on the battery storage side. And depending upon how the evolution of the energy storage resource construct, effective load carrying capacity, how price signals will go, and what RFPs are out there, that will really determine how quick we get in additional pumped hydro, how quick we get in different technologies, and how the overall grid will continue to evolve.
Thank you. Melanie, fear not, I think I need to jump in here and sort of defend transmission or trumpet transmission for this particular application. Transmission has been and will continue to be a good tool to balance variability. Geographic diversity, especially time zone diversity, is really a fast friend of wind and solar. There are economic efficiencies, reliability and resilience efficiencies, minimizing curtailment. So transmission really is a great enabler of renewables and balancing this variability. And yes, it is difficult to build, particularly in some regions, particularly where federal properties are so common. But nevertheless, I think I'll make my biased pitch for enhancement and expansion of the grid on that basis. And I'm sorry, panelists, I'm going to move on a little bit. I want to make sure we get to some other topics, so I'm already stepping on people's toes. But before I do that, let's check and see if there are questions from the audience.
David, I'm not seeing any questions yet.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to trudge ahead then, if that's the case. So let's get into the technologies a little bit. Paul, why don't you start us out? You know, what are the new cool capacity replacements that are on the horizon that you see? I mean, you are a cool guy, even though you probably feel old after Jim Robb's recitation of technology evolution. But what do you see from your perch?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that as Robb was rattling off all those pieces of technology, I realized that I actually owned all of them. And at one point had my own little museum in a bottom drawer in my old office. I finally threw that away. So Jim, thanks for reminding me that stuff was trash. As we look at some of the cool technologies that are coming on, first and foremost, what I want to do is I don't want to be a wet blanket, but we have to recognize that many of the things we're talking about aren't ready for prime time yet. So we have to be realistic as honest brokers when we talk about these things moving into the picture. We've heard a little bit about some of the movement that we've seen with renewables and battery storage, and how, while that is beneficial, it's not necessarily a one-for-one replacement for some of the baseload resources that we have today that certainly do prop up our reliability and resource adequacy within our grid. But as we look at these new technologies, I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that there's a lot of hope and promise, but we also need to recognize that we need to have real timelines and expectations of how those can come in, and we need to transition in order to get from point A to point B. And we're seeing a lot of that happen as utilities are trying to move towards their carbon goals, but recognizing that just jumping from a coal-fired generator to an advanced nuclear reactor isn't something you do overnight. So with that said, some of the really cool stuff that's happening, and I've seen a lot of it coming on board through the Idaho National Lab, is there's a tremendous amount of activity in the area of modular nuclear and advanced nuclear. And I sort of separate those, even though they're both advanced nuclear, just because when you start to get into some of the advanced nuclear, you start to talk too about micro reactors, where I think we're seeing some really, I'll just say it, cool stuff. We are seeing a timeline, though, for modular nuclear, for example, with NuScale. They anticipate that by the end of this decade, they'll have a facility online and operational commercially that will be a modular reactor that will be at the Idaho National Lab serving customers within the Western Interconnect. But as we also look, we're seeing investor-owned utilities that are dipping their toe in the water, most notably PacifiCorp, who has partnered up with TerraPower, and they're looking at a coal to nuclear project. It's natrium. Natrium's Latin for salt. And so what they're looking at is a coal to nuclear transition that could, in fact, be a model for replacement with a carbon-free baseload resource for other coal-fired generators within its fleet, and also something that could transition across the country as well. That project has about $2 billion coming into it through the recent Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act. So we're actually seeing these things move forward. But when we look at that infrastructure money that's popped in there was another piece that was put in for a project that'll happen up in Alaska. And it's actually looking at creating a micro reactor and having that thing take a step closer towards commercialization. That is phenomenal in terms of what that could mean. Because then when we look at the lab itself and what's happening, by the end of 2024, they anticipate having a 100 kW micro reactor called Marble that will actually be up and operational. And then in 2024, they hope to bring in what's called Project Pele, which will be the first transportable microreactor. And you can see that as a big game changer. When we talk about some of the issues with transmission and what you heard about earlier, obviously, there are a lot of transmission constraints. I've heard nuclear developers say that it is easier to get a nuclear reactor sited than it is new transmission. That's telling. So as we look at these possible transportable microreactors, if you start to look at eliminating stranded investment as you look at serving new load, there's a lot of potential, for example, to go to an industrial mining operation that, if you're an investor-owned utility, you can't just build a new generation resource. And you can't just build new transmission. You usually try to find a purchase power agreement to take care of that, because you can't run the risk of that stranded investment if that company should go belly up or they no longer need that generation resource. So you start to look at the potential for transportable micro reactors. There is an enormous potential for utilities and other players in that space to eliminate some of the concerns about stranded investment. And I think that as we look at that, it really does open up a lot of windows of opportunity. And then the potential as well to really dig into some of the other advancements that are happening with hydrogen and also with transmission. As I look at the lab, there's a huge piece, and I just want to touch on this briefly, with some of the transmission test grids, their microreactor net zero test beds. And as we look at all that, and Melanie Frye alluded to this earlier, there's a workforce issue. We need to recognize that as things get more complex, we start to look at bringing in new advanced resources. We look at trying to deal with that transition that needs to occur that we're all moving towards. There's a human factor as it relates to operation of the transmission grid. And that's an area that we can't overlook. It's getting more complex as we ask the transmission system to do more and more. And we all know it wasn't built to do what it's doing, but we're milking a lot out of it. And what's that going to mean to the people that are actually operating it as it gets more difficult? So I think that human factors piece is an area that really is significant. And the lab is doing a lot of work dipping its toe into that water to help move that along and figuring out, taking advantage of the things that they've learned from nuclear reactor operations and pushing that into the arena as it relates to human factors with transmission operations, especially as they become more complex. So I'll stop there and say thanks, Dave, for letting me ramble on. You knew that it would be difficult to shut me up, so I'm trying to wrap that up.
Difficult and impossible, but that's okay. Thanks, Paul. Erin, your turn.
Well, that's a hard act to follow, but excited to maybe talk a little bit more about some of the green hydrogen pieces that that Paul mentioned. So hopefully folks at this point have heard about the concept of green hydrogen. When folks say green hydrogen, they are generally talking about hydrogen that is produced from non-fossil fuel feedstocks or has relatively de minimis carbon emissions, so that this is hydrogen that can be compliant with carbon goals, right? Now, I want to be clear here, green hydrogen can be produced from organic feedstocks, but what I'm going to be talking to folks about today is specifically electrolytic hydrogen. So this is hydrogen that is produced from water using electricity, right? And so when we talk about hydrogen in this fashion, electrolytic hydrogen really is a long duration or even seasonal storage solution, because you have the option to take electricity, use it to produce hydrogen, and then use that hydrogen at a later date for electric production, right? And something that's been really important and extremely catalytic in the development of clean hydrogen has been federal funding. So for folks who haven't been following the hydrogen industry as closely, just at the end of September, the Department of Energy finally announced their Hydrogen Hubs FOA, where they will be looking to fund $6 to $7 billion worth of hydrogen hubs. This is expected to be huge when we talk about helping to reduce the cost of delivered hydrogen. Today, if you were to go to California, go to a hydrogen fueling station, you'd be looking at something like $14, $15 a kilogram. What we're talking about with these hydrogen hubs is being able to bring some of these costs down closer to $2 a kilogram delivered before the production tax credit. So this is huge reductions in delivered hydrogen costs that are enabled by foundational underpinning infrastructure, right? This is the same thing that we do with the electric system, with the gas system. We're building common carrier infrastructure that allows hydrogen to be delivered at scale for end use applications. Now, when we talk about hydrogen on the electric system specifically, there's really two interesting use cases that I want folks to have on their radar. The first is that electrolytic hydrogen production is flexible load, right? It is perfectly flexible load. The same way that we're talking about electric vehicles and trying to figure out how we can optimize the way that electric vehicles are charging and engaging with the grid, we have the same opportunity with electrolytic hydrogen production. We can manage the way that electrolyzers are pulling down electricity so that we're doing that in a way that's constructive as opposed to increasing demands for new capacity, new resources, what have you. The other thing that's really exciting about this electrolytic hydrogen piece is we are talking about very large scale electrolyzer deployments. We've recently been helping the Green Hydrogen Coalition look at a hydrogen hub in Los Angeles, and they're estimating in order to decarbonize some of the key sectors in that region, they're talking about 20 gigawatts of electrolyzers, right? This is not inconsequential amounts of capacity. This is huge, right? This has the ability to really change the way that we think about solving our supply and demand questions. Now, the other piece where hydrogen comes in is on the other side. Hydrogen can be used for power generation via either turbine or fuel cell. We're seeing a lot of interest right now in the opportunity to convert existing natural gas or coal turbines to run on hydrogen. In large part because it gives us an opportunity to reuse much of the infrastructure, reuse interconnection capacity. Frankly, it helps to really reduce the total changes that we're asking the electric system to take on. And I think that's been a big theme today, is that as we look forward, there's potentially significant disruption, and we need to be able to do this in a way that the system can adapt and we can continue to ensure reliable power delivery. So when we think about the opportunity to take a lot of our existing turbine-based resources and run them on clean fuels, there's a lot of appealing pieces about that just in terms of the transition costs. With that being noted, we are still hearing a lot of questions from environmental advocates, community advocates about, hey, what's going to be happening with this combustion-based hydrogen infrastructure? What are the air quality impacts? What does this mean for our legacy natural gas system and how we're thinking about evolving that? And candidly, people don't have the full answers to that yet. And so to Paul's point, we're not just going to be hopping in there and transitioning the system overnight. There's still some big questions to be working out about the role of green hydrogen as a capacity resource. But there are a lot of options here, especially because hydrogen is such a flexible resource. We're expecting to see such significant amounts of funding and infrastructure coming in. So we really do see this as being a kind of a core resource for providing some of that seasonal flexibility, seasonal capacity, helping to ride out some of those longer heat waves, what have you, but are working through a lot of the logistical questions, of what it means to bring these kinds of resources onto the grid.
And there's actually a point of intersection between you two, because I know there are a couple of pilot projects at nuclear plants where they're studying high temperature electrolysis, the energetics and the efficiency of those kinds of processes. So, all right. Check in again about questions from the audience, because if not,
we've got a few questions now, and I'll start at the most recent one because I think it's directly applicable to what Erin was just talking about. The question is, looking at hydrogen or electrolyzers, are there ways to make it less lossy from the conversion to hydrogen and back to electricity again?
I think you're muted, Erin.
3 years in, we're still doing it. Yes, the round trip efficiency is definitely a question here, right? Electrolytic hydrogen production and using it in a fuel cell or combusting is not nearly as efficient as lithium-ion batteries, right? And that's part of what we need to be thinking about. Definitely folks are working on the technology side to be driving improvements, but I think this also becomes a question then of just how we deploy these resources on the grid. We don't run peakers, right, as baseload. They have fundamental performance and operational attributes, and we take that into consideration when we think about how they get used. So we need to be bringing that same lens to hydrogen and say, okay, we have a resource. It doesn't have great round trip efficiency. It's got great seasonality. We know we can store a lot of energy. How does this fit into our overall portfolio approach? And how are we using this in concert with other clean energy resources like lithium ion storage, like our existing fleet, like modular nuclear, et cetera?
And Brandon, you're muted.
Did the same thing. So kind of a similar question, and I think Erin, you approached this from the hydrogen perspective, but the question is, battery storage is essentially short-term supply. How will we accommodate the long dark winter or a need for energy when there is less solar and wind? What role will nuclear, coal, and gas resources that are dispatchable have in a future RA obligation?
I'll jump in on the piece that we're seeing with nuclear. We've had an opportunity to go up to Alaska, which has some very dark, long winters. So in terms of looking at how you might be able to utilize advanced nuclear technology and microreactors there is something that state has a tremendous interest in. And if you look at a state like Alaska, by default, because of all the rural areas and small communities, they probably have more microgrids than any other state in the nation. And as a result, too, most of those microgrids are run with diesel. And if you can imagine what the cost of diesel would rise to as a result of the impacts that we've seen over in Europe, imagine what it was like before when they were paying $12 to $15 a gallon for diesel. So as they start to look at the potential for microreactors to come in and assist them, it doesn't mean they're not going to be looking at other renewable resources, but obviously solar in the winter in Alaska is probably not a good fit. But solar in the summer, fantastic. Wind to some extent, hydro to a little bit. But now you start to look at some of the advanced nuclear technology and how it could pair up with what David Boyd described as with hydrogen. And that is a key piece. One of my favorite labs that actually exists in Idaho Falls is one that looks, it's a net zero integrated microgrid. It's in a building, and they take solar, wind, they have EVs. They're trying to see how all this works with this heat and power source that emulates a nuclear reactor but isn't one. And right now they're making hydrogen along with that and demonstrating that can happen. So again, back to the expectations and realities, this technology isn't ready to fly off the shelf at Home Depot or Lowe's. It's as we look at these microreactors, I mean, we're still talking 5 to 10 years down the road, but the capacity building that needs to happen to help us make that transition needs to happen now. And that's where I think the labs and other resources and some of the research that we've heard about today from the private sector are extremely significant in helping us prepare to get to where we need to be.
Good. Brandon, we good?
Yep, one more, and the reason I want to ask this one is because we got a few different questions that asked a very similar thing, and that is when it comes to hydrogen production, we keep hearing about the drought, the scarcity of water in the West. How does that impact some of these hydrogen initiatives?
Yes, that's an excellent question. We are actually just wrapping up a study conducted with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory looking at water sufficiency in the West. And one of the key conclusions is, yes, we do need to make investments in water infrastructure. We're going to be adding some fairly significant water demands on the system, but the other key takeaway was that a lot of the existing municipal supply, whether it's wastewater treatment, stormwater, what have you, can actually help to meet hydrogen demand such that we're sort of coming out net neutral. So I think one of the things that we're starting to think about is if we know that we need to be looking at hydrogen as a resource for decarbonizing the electric sector, transport sector, industrial applications, et cetera, is there a way to use this to start catalyzing some of that water infrastructure development? Because I think the theme that is coming out clearly here is there's a lot of work to do and we need to get started sooner. And so how do we make sure that we're taking care of our water infrastructure as well as our energy infrastructure as we're approaching this transition?
All right, I'm shoving ahead, I'm moving on. I want to ask the panelists to gaze deeply into their crystal balls for a moment. What's the future of legacy generating resources? Pat, I'm going to go to you first, but I imagine several of you have comments on this one. And be as concise as you can in the interest of time.
Sounds great. Well, I wish I did have that crystal ball. That would be great. It would be great for our transition. And as I think we're having this conversation today, what's really, coming out of this for me is that this transition period is likely to be one of the most difficult, the growing pains part, right? Because ultimately, we are going to have some technological advances that get us where we need to be to meet these targets in the future. But if they don't, as we're trying to figure out how to get those in place, that's going to be where we have to keep our eye on the ball and to make sure that we have a diverse set of resources in our portfolio to ensure resource adequacy and balancing. And I believe that natural gas, particularly those with fast ramping capabilities, are going to continue to be a critical part of that portfolio for the foreseeable future. For example, I think I've read that California during this extreme heat wave, generally where they used 32% gas, went up at times to use up gas at 60% to meet demand. So I just think we have to be very careful in looking at how we move forward. And quickly, I'll just mention that we do see gas as playing an integral role as a building block in the clean energy future. We have members that are partnering with renewables and making billions of dollars in clean energy technologies and investments and resources so that we can continue to play a role in a clean energy future.
Jeff, mention has already been made about existing fossil plants, about the infrastructure that's there, the value of the infrastructure, the great value of the interconnection rights that are there. I know this is something you've thought about. Why don't you give me a readout on your take on reuse or the value of those sites?
Yeah, definitely. So just like whenever you think of Macy's in New York City, the value does not come from actually selling goods. The value comes from having that real estate of that beautiful building in Midtown. And so in a similar way, whenever we're looking across the thermal portfolio, there are a fair amount of just really inefficient thermal out there right now that are uneconomic. And so then it becomes a question of what do you do with it? And so we're teaming up with Talon in Maryland to put a pilot 20 megawatt battery project on a retiring coal plant. We're seeing in California, Vistra is retiring 110 megawatt jet fuel plant and partially replacing it with a battery. And so we're going to be seeing more of those. We're seeing up in New York, folks are using interconnection from existing thermal plants for connecting offshore wind into the city. And so whenever we look across everything, there will be ample opportunities to go from thermal plants, use those capacity rights, even though it's really tricky in order to figure out exactly how you can use those capacity rights in some cases, but using those capacity rights to be able to put in wind, solar, batteries, new technologies, et cetera. So we're going to be seeing more.
I want to go off on a little bit of a tangent for just a second and ask about the grid and markets. Those are not legacy facilities per se, but those are the things we use to facilitate trade. Are we operating efficiently in terms of the grid and the markets? And do the market products incent the right generation? Are they incenting reliability? Are we doing the right things or not? And if not, what should we be doing? Erin, I'll let you jump in on that. Small little question.
Do you want me to take it first? Yeah, overall, you know, what the grid really needs as we're seeing more of these extreme cases from, you know, the heat wave in September to, you know, polar vortexes, we do need the really long duration storage. And right now, the market does not incent for that to happen. And so, you know, I assume in the next years, it's going to be a continued topic at RTOs and ISOs as we have more of these extreme weather events.
Erin, did you want to jump on this one?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this one. Don't want to take too much time. I mean, I think you're baiting us a little bit on this. Are our markets set up right? I mean, we all know that there's need for evolution, right? So, my background is in California. I worked at SoCal Edison for a little bit, right? And you know, California has been operating on a 4-hour RA construct for a very long time. Does a 4-hour RA construct reward natural gas generators for being available 24/7? Does a 4-hour RA construct encourage 8-hour storage? Does a 4-hour RA construct encourage seasonal storage? No, right? It has worked very well for what we've needed in the past. And I think there's growing recognition that many of these things are not fit for purpose as we move forward to thinking about different resources and thinking about the attributes of these resources and the attributes that we're trying to incent. But if we don't have the right markets, it's really hard for developers, independent power producers to be bringing the right resources to utility RFPs, to PPAs, what have you, because they don't get paid for those attributes. And if they don't get paid for them, why are they offering them up? So if we want to see these kinds of resources come onto the grid, we need to find ways to send signals to the folks who are building these resources, because it's very clear. We tell them what we're looking for. We tell them we're willing to pay them. They show up, right? That's what the renewables rush has been. It's been us setting clear market signals, setting stable procurement approaches, and seeing the market respond. So what we need to do as we're thinking about this future is figure out how we evolve these tools. Now, of course, as with everything else we've talked about today, not easy to develop new market products, not easy to reform the resource adequacy construct, but it is a big part of laying the right groundwork for where we're trying to go. So while everyone's figuring out technology advancements, new science, there's some work to be done on the market and economic side to be ready for that.
I probably resent the fact that you thought I baited you, but I'm probably guilty of that. So let's check audience questions before I go totally off the rails.
Yeah, we had one question come in. Are clean coal technologies at a point where they can help keep coal resources in clean energy portfolios?
Well, I don't claim to be a clean coal expert. We've certainly Royal, we have tried to invest in carbon capture and improving the efficiency of those processes for some time. And there's a new bucket of money out of the Department of Energy on that front too. I have to believe the answer to that question is no. But it will be as important for, I think, natural gas going forward as it is for coal going forward to see some advancement in that area. Pat, maybe you have a little sense of this question.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a very important advancement for natural gas in the future is carbon capture technologies. And, you know, there is quite a bit of investment in that. But again, we've got a long way to go to be reaching the emission targets that we, you know, all are embracing for a net zero future, right? And just kind of circling back in response to, I very much agree with a lot of the things that Erin said about having the right price signals in the market. I'm much more familiar with the markets in the East, the organized markets in the East, but I think all areas of the country are going to struggle with how to keep existing resources financially viable during this transition when these units are relied upon increasingly less, but yet they remain critical to maintaining reliability. So compensation issues, can we develop market-based approaches that place the proper value on reliability to, ensure retention of these resources?
All right. We're going to charge ahead. So let's talk a little bit about opportunities and challenges that come with new customer technologies. There's been mention of heat pumps and changing the heating regime, home electrification broadly, electric vehicles. Jeff, why don't you give us your take on new customer technologies?
Yeah, so we definitely saw during this past summer in California the ability to actually start aggregating and being able to participate in the market in different ways. And fork order 2222, which will allow for the aggregation of pretty much anything, will really help drive that and be able to completely transform how distributed resources interact. And so just during this past summer, we saw a virtual power plant in PG&E territory put out 16.5 megawatts whenever power was most needed. We saw STEM with its behind the meter C&I portfolio push out power to the grid when it was needed there. And so we're going to be seeing a really interesting intersection between software and aggregated technologies that's really just going to be completely changing patterns. And it's an opportunity, and quite frankly, it scares me. We look at all these rental car fleets going electric, and distribution lines going into airports weren't really made for that. And so it becomes a question of how are we going to be able to aggregate everything together, especially at the distribution level. At the utility scale level, I think we'll be fine, but distribution level, I don't think anybody has really figured out how to approach.
Paul, what are you thinking about this question?
Well, as I hear about aggregating a lot of the newer technologies, I mean, one thing that easily comes to mind is EVs, electric vehicles, and charging stations. And what we hear about being probably the most significant thing that should happen moving forward are the fast charging stations that are somewhere between 15 to 20 minutes. And I think it was just brought up that the concerns that you may have with the distribution system when you start to see critical mass of those charging stations, because they draw such a huge load, forces us to rethink how we manage the distribution system. And I think microgrids are going to be playing a much bigger piece of that puzzle going forward as we start to see that deployment. I will say that I was in the Los Angeles airport earlier in September, and my phone started buzzing, and every phone around me started buzzing. And I looked over to my wife, who's almost always on her phone, communicating with our kids. And before I could even ask, if it was an Amber Alert, she says, "You've got to see this." And it was a message for everybody to not use electricity to avoid a blackout. And as I see that happening in today's environment, I wonder what we need to be looking at moving forward as we start to look at some of these other technologies coming into the mix. Because I think sometimes we as regulators, and I still say I'm recovering, we do a little bit of intellectual trespassing. We get into areas, start deploying technologies because policy says X, Y, Z, but we don't really look at things and their impact at scale. And I think that has to happen now. We need to learn those lessons so that we can avoid some of the problems we're seeing today.
Brandon, I'm going to check in with you. Otherwise, I'm going to go back to the recovering regulator with another question.
We do have a couple of questions that are kind of fairly loosely tied to some of these topics, but we can wait to the end to ask those if we want to just keep pushing forward on this topic.
I was actually going to follow Paul's train of thought a little bit about regulators and how they operate. So kind of a shift of gears. I'll leave it up to you. Do you want to answer those now? Brandon, did you want to take these questions now?
I would say let's wait till the end if we have time.
So, well, and my dog has just joined me right on cue. Paul, I think this is a really interesting question. We can talk about the technologies. We can talk about the advancements. We can talk about, introducing policy and marrying it to technology, but how do current regulatory constructs either support or challenge resource adequacy in the West? And what do we need to do to advance the ball? So put your regulator hat back on.
Okay, I'll put it back on. We have seen within the last decade or more, public policy being driven on the regulatory side from legislative and executive orders and law. And the bottom line is when a legislation or an executive order directs the regulator to jump, the regulator usually has two questions. One is how high, and two, can I use a trampoline? When these cases get in front of them and we see how cases move forward, a regulator can only make a decision based on the issues that are actually in the record. They can't just say, my gut tells me. It's got to be in the record. So developing a record, I think, is one of the key pieces moving forward. And the question is, who are those honest brokers and interveners that can bring that information into the mix that can get us what we need to know? Because one of the things that I've learned from being around the folks at the lab is you can make any technology work on the lab bench, but it's when you get it to scale is when you discover the problems. So if we as regulators are looking at the current regulatory structure and making decisions based on that, where do we find that honest broker information? How does that get into the mix so that we're actually making better decisions? Because when you look at the backgrounds of regulators, I mean, whether they're, if you're an elected regulator, your claim to fame and your credibility to get there was you got one more vote than your opponent. If you were like me, an appointed regulator, your big claim to fame was that you knew the governor. So we have to find ways in which regulators who average tenure is between 3.5 to 4 years, that's it. And about the time they learn the job, they're gone. So that's where I think national associations and regional efforts like WECC and others and that outreach really can help regulators, if you can pull them in, to get a better understanding of how they can integrate this knowledge into the system so they're making better decisions. Thanks for the question, and I'm sorry for the rambling answer.
Erin?
I mean, I think Paul hit on a lot of it, right? We're asking a lot of our regulators, we're asking them to navigate this, challenging transition. None of us have all the answers. And are we giving them the right tools and information to start making those decisions, right? I think something that we've been seeing recently that's kind of as an interesting data point is, for example, what resources are being included in IRPs, right? If it's not even included as a potential resource in the planning process, how do we think about its role? How do we even have a chance to think about its role on the grid, right? Do we have the right tools and analytical approaches to be answering these questions? Historically, we used stack analysis, right? When I started doing resource planning, my boss showed me the stack of resources and how it met up with demand, and that's no longer how we're able to plan the grid. And so if we don't give regulators the tools and the information that they need to make these decisions, it's really not fair to be expecting them to be able to have, to Paul's point, the opportunity to make smart, informed decisions to guide this transition. The other thing is regulators are looking at their individual state. And I think the other thing that we haven't discussed today, but is very true, is this is very much a regional question and a regional problem, right? Like we need to be balancing over a much wider region than just one state. WECC has the joy of having to bring a lot of those challenges together and come up with solutions, but they are at the end of the day relying on regulators to making good decisions for their own jurisdictional regions. And so, there's a lot of questions there about how do we come together and make smart decisions and have the right information to make those smart decisions.
There's no doubt that when you move to issues of a regional nature, you need regional conversations and regional solutions. And so in transmission planning or in now the Western Resource Adequacy Program, those are good steps forward, but they are going to build out of those individual system designs state by state that then hopefully move upward in a productive way. Jeff, I know you've got some thoughts on this one too.
Yeah, the other really tricky part about this from a regulator perspective is that these newer technologies that are coming in, we don't have the dedicated regulatory resources internally that the established technologies do. And so if you go into any ISO working group, you know, people that own just 1 or 2 thermal plants will have a full-time regulatory person sitting there participating in the process. Versus if you look at the entire energy storage industry, you know, there have been several states where we've been the only one that, you know, has intervened or submitted comments on, you know, the estimated costs and integrated resource plans. And so that's the other really tricky part about this is that the new technologies that are coming up, finding, as I believe Paul said, the honest broker that, you know, can actually, you know, communicate effectively on what's happening now and where it's going whenever the individual companies don't have the resources to do that.
I don't know if you had a thought on this or not.
Yeah, well, I mean, I believe that this is one area where WECC and NERC can play a really essential role in helping regulators, policymakers, by being that honest broker and providing, you know, realistic estimates of what, you know, what reality looks like, and to take out, you know, any political agendas or issues with, you know, if someone is promoting a particular fuel source, it's automatically, in a lot of cases, going to lack credibility, whether it's right or not. And so if we can also find ways for all resources to work together and, you know, put our heads together and check each other, you know, build coalitions to look at what does reality look like, because it's too important to get wrong. We've got to get this right. From the gas standpoint, in terms of regulation, we also need some type of market design, regulatory constructs that provide some type of certainty for gas generators that, you know, operate more on a just-in-time procurement basis. That can be risky, particularly when you have constrained pipeline systems and you want them to be able to make their purchases during the liquid time of the gas market. So it's a lot of components to put together here. It's going to take a lot of people working together to make it happen and to maintain reliability.
Brandon, I'm going to jump back to you now.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions. Other than the request to reduce use, like the example that Paul shared, are there ways that we can incentivize customer behavior patterns to help manage resource adequacy?
I'll just throw in the obvious one, and it's with demand side management programs. I know a lot of utilities and regulators have some very mature programs. I know there's also a lot of money coming out of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And maybe it's an opportunity to look at ways in which they could leverage some of that money to take some broader additional steps towards some of those demand side management projects that previously, without that funding, might have been on the margins and too expensive. And now maybe this could help bring those costs down and take some more positive steps towards demand side management that is permanent and ongoing.
I'd just add on to Paul. I think this goes back to our question of how are we compensating resources. When Paul and everyone else in California got that text, load dropped. Like, you can go to the ISO website and you can see it, and that load drop probably, you know, saved some pretty bad outcomes that were potential, right? So how are we valuing that customer response, and how do we make sure that it's something that we can do without having to text 30 to 40 million people and hoping that they look at their phones and turn off the dishwasher, right? Are there ways that this can become a standard part of our toolkit and compensate people in a way that makes it sustainable?
and the only thing I would add on to that, and I really appreciate what you said, is that a policy of expecting customers to do the right thing is one that I don't feel so comfortable with. Yes, they may do it the first time and the second time. But what about the third and the 10th time? When are they going to say, oh, my neighbor will do this, I won't? If we're expecting people to do the right thing, I don't feel, based on coming off of COVID and expecting people to do the right thing, and you can take that wherever you want to go, I'm not sure that that's something that we would feel good about. So I agree wholeheartedly that there needs to be another approach into looking at how to get the right customer response when it's needed.
Brandon, you got another one in there?
Yeah, this one is kind of related to the topic of micronuclear. Probably a question for Paul. How will security and waste requirements for nuclear facilities be met for micro-scale units?
So what we're seeing is that the emergency planning zone for some of these micro reactors, when you look at the large light water reactors, you're looking at the emergency planning zone being around 9 to 10 miles. As we start to look at these micro reactors, sometimes you're just seeing the fence around the unit, less than an acre. So that's one big plus on this. Also, you're seeing more contained systems. So there's less likelihood of failure. And that's what's been tested at labs for the last several decades on this technology. First and foremost, these technologies aren't experimental. The labs have been working with them and testing them for decades. So maybe it's safe to say it's the first time they're in the wild. As far as the waste issue, dry cast storage is likely going to be the path forward. And there's a lot of talk too about, is this waste in the end? Is it time for the US to start looking at reprocessing the fuel? And that I think is a key piece of the puzzle as we talk about the future for waste storage. I heard it described by someone much smarter than me, that when we talk about spent rods, they're spent after 5 years, whether they're spent or not by some people's standards. And he said that what's being called a spent rod today is the equivalent of burning the bark off of a log and then saying it's spent fuel. So there's a lot within the waste material today that if we could reprocess, there's the ability to reduce the total amount of waste instead of just the once through process that we have now. So again, there's a lot of work that has to happen there. There's a lot that needs to occur with the NRC and others, but there are opportunities there to, again, even reduce some of the waste impact with those. So it's a great question. Things are getting better and better. And issues surrounding the safety and environmental impacts of these units has also improved tremendously as well.
Okay, and we have one more question from the audience. Melanie mentioned improved communication as part of the reason for improved response to the heat event in 2022 versus 2020. Can the panelists comment on the need and means of communication between organizations that may improve the impact of resource adequacy challenges?
I hesitate to jump in here. I do think there's an educational component that sort of precedes the communication component, and maybe I'm naive, but I think the tragedy in Texas probably helped people in California realize that the heat event and the potential of a grid failure is something they ought not take lightly. It's a terrible way to educate customers, homeowners, ratepayers, if you will. But I think, to Paul's bad feeling about whether people will comply or not, I think if they don't understand the consequences of the request, then the likelihood of compliance goes down. I think there's a lot of communication that has to go across, say, state agencies, commissions and governors' staff, commissioners and legislators. And ultimately, when something goes wrong, everybody's to blame and everybody gets harmed. But I think these programs are only going to be as efficient as you have a reasonably learned or educated customer class.
I guess just adding in on that, I already poked fun a little bit at the text message, grid management by text message kind of situation that California was in this fall, right? But I think there is a real need to get these things and these responses much more automated. I think what we've seen is it's no longer an exception to have a multi-day heat dome. It's no longer an exception to see unprecedented weather events. The grid needs to endure, and also everyone who's doing their day job at the grid needs to not be totally yanked out of everything that they're doing in order to respond to these things. So what are the steps that we need to take to make sure that if you want my dishwasher off, you've got an automated way to tell me that, and I have an automated way to respond, right? What are the ways that we communicate between different regions? I know that when the temperatures were up in California, up here in Portland, it was very balmy and I was still on a demand response event, right? So how are we making sure that there is that regional visibility and coordination, and that it's not text messages, desperate phone calls from the ISO office to make sure that these things are happening? Because every indication we have right now is just that this is the new normal, and we need to operationalize the way that we're approaching our responses here.
That was a much better answer than mine, I have to say. Brandon, in light of the hour, I think I need to turn things back to you to wrap up. Let me offer my thanks to the panel for some really interesting conversation and insight. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, thank you, David, to you and the panelists for the great discussion today. Great insights were gained from this conversation. And I'm going to actually turn it over to Travis.
Right. Brandon, I appreciate it. To all of our panelists, David, Erin, Jeff, Pat, Paul, thank you so much. David, I appreciate you stepping in to moderate there, and thank you to the audience members for sharing the questions today. Couldn't help but that heat dome is a great segue, shameless plug for our next resource adequacy discussion series that's happening on November 2nd. Same time, same place. It'll be at 10 to 11:30 on November 2nd. We'll be talking about resource adequacy in relation to those heat domes. So that's the topic for next month's discussion. So tune back in there. You'll see a QR code on your screen right now. And in the chat, we're providing a link to a survey. We're asking that attendees and panelists as well share your thoughts on the resource adequacy series that we've had here. This is a new event for us at WECC this summer, and we're trying to get a glimpse of your thoughts, the value, certain topics you'd like us to explore in the future. So we appreciate you participating in that. And with that being said, I'm going to just thank everyone again for joining us, and we'll end a couple minutes early here.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, all. Take care.